Olá, bom dia! Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao nosso quinto Encontros Doar, nosso quinto ano nos reunindo para falar sobre maneiras de construir uma nação mais doadora. É uma alegria estar aqui com vocês. Para quem não me conhece, eu sou a Roberta Faria, presidente do Instituto MOL, e a gente vai estar juntos de hoje até sexta-feira, todo dia às 10 da manhã, para uma série de boas conversas sobre cultura de doação, responsabilidade cívica e impacto social. Sempre de olho nas coisas que estão acontecendo no momento, nas discussões mais quentes, contemporâneas e que levam a gente a refletir sobre questões sistêmicas mais profundas. E claro que não podia deixar de ser que o tema desse ano é tudo a ver com o momento que a gente está vivendo. Doar é um ato político, fortalecer a sociedade civil para transformar hoje a realidade. Por aqui a gente entende que, para muito além de siglas partidárias, as nossas escolhas, a nossa forma como a gente se posiciona, a maneira como a gente consome, tudo, absolutamente tudo que a gente faz é uma forma de fazer política. E mesmo quando a gente escolhe não fazer, a gente está se alinhando ao status quo. Então também é política. Existir em sociedade é um ato político. Hoje nós temos a presença especial do meu amigo, sócio, cofundador da editora MOL e do Instituto MOL, presidente do Conselho do Instituto MOL, Rodrigo Piponzi, que foi quem conversou com esse convidado internacional desse primeiro dia e que vai nos contar um pouco mais sobre como foi essa entrevista. Bom dia, Rodrigo.
Bom dia, Roberta, tudo bom?
Tudo bem.
Tudo. Prazer estar aqui mais uma vez no nosso Encontro Doar, quinta edição do evento. Começou, lembra, lá atrás, presencial, na Unibis, e que acho que cada ano vem ganhando mais relevância para a gente falar sobre cultura de doação. Realmente, acho que a gente vai abrir com, acho que vai abrir com o pé direito aqui o nosso Encontro Doar. Mas antes de eu falar dessa primeira conversa, eu queria fazer uma menção especial, um agradecimento ao Movimento Bem Maior, nosso grande parceiro, grande apoiador do Encontros Doar, de tantos outros projetos do Instituto MOL. Para quem não conhece o Movimento Bem Maior, a gente vai, antes de seguir em frente aqui, passar um vídeo super especial que conta o trabalho deles.
Apesar da responsabilidade principal do Estado, no cuidado das pessoas e do ambiente, isso não pode limitar os cidadãos e as empresas no sentido de colaborar também, de contribuir.
Na hora de praticar a filantropia, temos que escolher bons projetos. Como os recursos já são escassos, vamos aplicar em projetos que de fato vão contribuir para a mudança social.
Somos o Movimento Bem Maior, uma organização social sem fins lucrativos. Nós mobilizamos, conectamos, articulamos pessoas para fortalecer o ecossistema do terceiro setor. Filantropia não é só caridade ou solidariedade. Filantropia estratégica fortalece o terceiro setor por meio das suas organizações sociais, que em ações coordenadas podem buscar soluções a médio e longo prazo para o Brasil.
Filantropia é super necessária. A gente não consegue mudar uma sociedade sem a filantropia como uma ferramenta básica. Então, o que eu faço com carinho é poder ter todo o apoio do Movimento Bem Maior para escolher os melhores projetos, os projetos que vão realmente servir como uma ferramenta para o bem da sociedade.
Nós somos a sociedade civil e nós precisamos mobilizar a cultura de doação no país.
Em vez de pensar só no nosso bem, a gente pensa bem no bem coletivo.
Muito bom. Trabalhar com quem a gente admira é sempre uma alegria e faz as coisas ficarem ainda melhores. Para quem quiser conhecer melhor o trabalho do Movimento Bem Maior, vale buscá-los nas redes sociais e também acessar o site movimentobemmaior.org.br. Especialmente para quem trabalha no terceiro setor, eles têm grandes editais para distribuição de recursos e projetos de formação que apoiam o desenvolvimento institucional de dezenas, centenas de organizações. Vale muito a pena conhecer. E a gente agradece também o apoio do Instituto Mandarina, que fortalece o trabalho do Instituto MOL e nos ajuda a manter os projetos tão importantes para a cultura da doação que a gente desenvolve por aqui, inclusive esse evento. E você pode acompanhar uma parte deles antes de começar a transmissão, e que até o final da semana a gente vai apresentar todos por aqui. O Desculpa a Sua Causa, o nosso podcast, o nosso guia de produtos sociais. Tem muita coisa legal que a gente tem feito que a gente quer contar para vocês. Mas vamos ao que interessa da nossa conversa. Rodrigo, conta um pouquinho sobre quem é essa pessoa incrível que você entrevistou, né, para esse primeiro dia do encontro.
Bom, como eu falei, né, acho que a gente não podia começar melhor. Eu bati um papo há algumas semanas, que vai ser transmitido agora na sequência, com o François Bonnici. O François, ele é o head, né, o diretor-geral da Fundação Schwab, que é um dos maiores grupos, né, de empreendedores sociais do mundo, grupo que a gente tem a honra de fazer parte, né, desde 2019. A Fundação Schwab foi criada dentro do Fórum Econômico Mundial, então está dentro de uma agenda, né, muito grande, muito presente, junto a lideranças políticas, estados e tudo mais. O François, ele é uma figura que dispensa comentários quando a gente fala, né, de entender e estudar o empreendedorismo social no Brasil, o papel dos empreendedores sociais, dos negócios sociais, do terceiro setor. Ele acabou de lançar um livro muito interessante, que na verdade foi a pauta da nossa conversa, né, que fala muito sobre as mudanças sistêmicas, né, como se comportam as mudanças sistêmicas no mundo. Ele tem visões muito particulares, muito profundas sobre isso. Foi realmente uma aula, assim, conversar com ele, com qualidade, com tempo, né, como a gente fez. E, enfim, vou parar de falar, vou deixar a gente transmitir o papo e depois a gente volta aqui para poder conversar um pouquinho mais sobre tudo que a gente aprendeu nessa primeira conversa.
Muito bom. Bom, a gente gravou antecipadamente essa conversa justamente para dar acesso. O François é sul-africano, vive na Suíça, onde fica a Fundação Schwab, e como esse papo foi em inglês, a gente gravou antes para poder transmitir hoje para vocês, já traduzido e com legendas para facilitar o acesso para todo mundo. Eu queria, antes de abrir, só contar uma historinha assim rápida que eu acho que é muito marcante para quem trabalha com cultura de doação e no terceiro setor em geral, ainda mais nesse ano de tantas questões políticas. Quando a gente conheceu o François pela primeira vez, foi em 2019, eu e o Rodrigo tínhamos acabado de receber a imensa honra de ganhar o título de empreendedores sociais do ano da Fundação Schwab, e a gente vai receber esse prêmio lá em Nova York, e junto com vários outros empreendedores sociais do mundo inteiro, trabalhando nas mais diversas frentes, né? Gente que lida com questões de luz e saneamento na África, com reciclagem de lixo na América Latina, com questões de educação na Ásia, enfim, tem todas as causas, todos os tipos de empreendimentos. E você vendo tantas pessoas fazendo tantas coisas incríveis, e aquele era só mais um ano, na verdade o prêmio existe há vários anos, é uma rede de centenas de empreendedores, e aí é muito bom você estar junto com eles para ver ao mesmo tempo que você não está sozinho na sua luta, tem muitas pessoas com os mesmos desafios, e compartilhar também essas soluções dá mais esperança para o futuro, e você descobre outras maneiras de resolver o mesmo problema, né? Uma solução que está sendo testada, talvez, lá no Quênia, pode servir para um problema que a gente está tendo aqui no Mato Grosso. Então, é muito, muito linda essa troca, isso é muito forte, compartilhar soluções em grupo. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, já era uma angústia, assim, né? Eu lembro de ter essa conversa com o François durante um café, assim, a gente vê tanta gente fazendo tanta coisa incrível, e por que a gente ainda está nesse ponto, né? Por que a gente ainda tem os problemas que a gente tem? Se tem tantas soluções, né, a gente sabe tantas respostas, por que a gente continua porque ainda existe fome, porque ainda existe, né, tantas questões de intolerância, de desigualdade, né, porque tantas crianças ainda ficam para trás na educação, porque tanta gente morre de doenças básicas, porque não tem água limpa. E ele falou uma visão de esperança, assim, né? Ele falou, acho que a gente tem que olhar para o lugar, não para todos os problemas que a gente tem para enfrentar agora, mas para onde a gente veio, né? E se você olhar para 20 anos atrás, 50 anos atrás, 100 anos atrás, 200, 300 anos, né, atrás, as coisas estavam muito piores, na verdade. A gente deu grandes saltos de desenvolvimento social nas últimas décadas, e a perspectiva é que as coisas melhorem cada vez mais à medida que a gente compartilha conhecimento e compartilha maneiras de acessar e aplicar esse conhecimento, o que passa, com certeza absoluta, pela captação de recursos e por uma cultura de doação, porque a gente precisa de recursos para botar as soluções que a gente sabe que existem em prática e para desenvolver, pesquisar e encontrar outras soluções. E é importante entender que os problemas não se resolvem, né, da noite para o dia, porque eles também não foram criados da noite para o dia, a maior parte dele tem razões sistêmicas profundas, está enraizado no racismo estrutural, na desigualdade social que vem da história inteira da humanidade. Então, a gente vai levar tempo para resolver problemas que são muito complexos, mas a gente está resolvendo e a gente está caminhando, e mesmo em momentos que as coisas não parecem estar tão boas, que a gente olha e fala, como é possível isso ainda estar acontecendo, a gente tem que lembrar que já foi pior e que está melhor e vai melhorar mais ainda se a gente seguir aqui na nossa luta. Acho que isso é só um pouquinho para vocês entenderem o espírito desse entrevistado tão incrível, e agora a gente põe ao ar aqui a nossa conversa que o Rodrigo teve, com legendas para todo mundo poder assistir, e a gente volta no final. Se vocês tiverem comentários, quiserem fazer perguntas, por favor, coloquem no chat, a gente comenta no final, e se tiver perguntas para o François, a gente leva até eles e traz de volta depois para vocês. Até mais.
Olá, pessoal, tudo bem? Eu sou Rodrigo Pipons, eu sou cofundador da Editora MOL, presidente do Conselho do Instituto MOL. É um prazer estar aqui no 5º Encontros Doar, uma série de conversas sobre filantropia e impacto social. Hoje eu tenho o prazer de receber um convidado sul-africano, um especialista em mudanças sistêmicas. O François Bonnici, ele é o head da Schwab Foundation, que é uma das grandes redes de empreendedores sociais do mundo, da qual eu e a Roberta Faria temos prazer de participar. O François acabou de lançar um livro que fala exatamente sobre esse tema das mudanças sistêmicas, da importância da gente trabalhar dentro de 3 princípios nesse campo: o princípio do contexto, o princípio da mudança de relações de poder dentro do campo e o princípio da colaboração. Eu tive um papo muito bacana com ele, que a gente vai transmitir agora. Foi um papo que trouxe muita coisa importante para quem está envolvido com o campo, ou mesmo quem não está e quer conhecer mais, aprender e escutar. Então, espero que vocês se divirtam, gostem dessa conversa que eu tive com o François Bonnici, head da Schwab Foundation e do World Economic Forum. Hello, everyone. Today I have the great honor of speaking with physician and professor François Bonnici. He's currently the director of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship and head of social innovation at the World Economic Forum. François has also just launched, alongside researcher Cynthia Heiner, the book The Systems Work of Social Change. The book brings together the results of years of research with social organizations worldwide, seeking practice that cause profound changes in our social and environmental reality. François, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. Can we bring François to the screen?
Rodrigo, lovely to see you, and thank you so much. Muito obrigado. It's really a privilege to be here, to work with Instituto MOL. It's been really a pleasure. So I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. We are very happy to have you here too. So I'm going to fire the first question. We're very interested, of course, in your work, in your book. And in the introduction of the book, you and Cynthia talk about the duality of combating social problems. While there have been significant advances, like in the field, the impression that there is still a lot to be done remains. That would give us a feeling of powerlessness or pessimism about the future. How this factor impact the struggle for social change so far?
Thanks, Rodrigo. I think many of us who work in this space feel that same dichotomy, right? This tension. And I think in many ways, the book, started almost as a personal journey. And I think for many of us who have worked in these spaces, it is personal, right? This is not only an academic exercise, it's also a deeply personal one. I was a physician. I was practicing in South Africa and several other countries around the world and in Africa, and have this tension between the immediate urgency of fixing the problems in front of us versus recognizing that most of the reason these problems exist, have a deeper rooted systemic problem at the heart of it. And some of that is our history growing up in South Africa and in Brazil. You will also have some of these historical problems that we continue to see the consequences of today. And yet there are many things happening, as we know, in our daily world, whether it's geopolitics or inflation, etc., that are impacting the local situation at the same time. So how do we, as individual actors, how do we start to feel that we have some agency and control over all of these things? So it is common that people who work in the social change sector feel overwhelmed, and sometimes you get cynical or pessimistic. And I think our work has been so uplifting and so full of hope, because we've seen organizations and worked with organizations that have demonstrated that, over time, there are ways to have a sense of agency over these longer term challenges and work both on the immediate and the long term at the same time. How to do that is obviously the challenge that many of us know. I think that one realization is, we can't do that alone. But certainly this sense of there's still so much to be done is something that drives, those actors in the social sector as well as the donors. And I think the role of donors is, we're going to talk about, but I think is critical in having the balance between these mindsets. And I think also the pandemic has shown us and taught us many things, both in terms of how we can collaborate beyond individual organizations and institutions, how we can have hope in some of the darkest times, and how that our kind of mindset around how we've approached, and we talk about this, in the opening chapter, that we have modeled this industrial model, this industrial mindset, this linear mindset of creating change, and that one of the ways to kind of overcome that feeling of powerlessness and pessimism is starts with a mindset change.
Nice, and it's interesting also that in the book you came along with like a series of principles that guide the real social change, which you call the system work.
Yeah.
Can you summarize them for me and tell us a bit more about this?
Of course. I think part of this book emerged from being part of conversations around systems change, which we now hear, is quite common in the world, quite common in the social sector, recognizing we need systems change, but people meant very different things by it. And I think the conversations are often in the global north were quite different to what we were seeing as some of the approaches that we were seeing where we were in South Africa and many of the other emerging economies we worked in and looked at organizations around the world. And so there was a disconnect between some vague idea of change in the future versus the work we needed to do today, right? And that's why the emphasis of the book is around systemic work. How do we do that work? It's about the process of change rather than some grand outcomes. Yes, we all want those grand outcomes, but it's actually only going to be about how we change the way we do work that will lead to that. And so that was the emphasis. And I think when we looked across the world, we interviewed over 150 different practitioners and experts. We looked at 8 organizations in depth around the world and how their work was leading to some of these deeper, more transformative, lasting systemic changes, whether at a policy level or at a kind of normative and mindset and cultural level, whether it was changing the way many actors worked. There were some very common principles that they all worked with. Those were really about connection, context, and power, right? So connection, we identified 3 kind of broad principles that they all worked with, and a set of practices that actually looked at the organizational strategies, practices, and tactics of how they work. So a big part was really about cultivating collectives, changing and building, a common identity between people, even though they may be, at odds with each other or don't feel like they're part of a unit. So a really important piece clearly of today is understanding how do we do collaborative work, but also how do we build agency in people. And so, one of the other critical practices was really equipping problem solvers. And I think we've seen that again and again, that one of the big changes, certainly for us and certainly in my career now, looking at social innovation, is not about, the delivery of finding new ways to deliver products and services to people who need them, but really about the creation of agency for people to develop the capacities to lead, to make decisions, and to develop their own solutions. And so overwhelmingly, these were the strongest examples that really led to much more transformative change. And a lot of that is about context, so it's really embracing the context and understanding that actually people that live in the context, that people that live, that have lived experience, which is the words that are used, are best placed to make decisions about complexity. We heard a lot of the system change conversation being, coming from complexity science, right? From an academic perspective of complexity. And the more you think about that, the more educated, you need to be to think about complexity. But actually, it was very interesting speaking that through all of our work, recognizing the greatest point of complexity was often, didn't seem that complex to the people who were actually in it. So that if you're thinking about education, the greatest point of complexity, in other words, lots of different interactions happening, was the interaction between a teacher and a child. Actually, if you ask the teacher, in a primary school, what's probably needed to improve their environment for the children, will give you some quite straightforward and useful answers about how the whole system might need to change, but that it plays out at that setting. So recognizing that complexity is not necessarily overwhelming, but if we put, ask the questions and give the decision making to people in context, we're probably far more likely to get better kinds of solutions. Right? And the last bit was really around reconfiguring power and looking at real practical ways to do that, given so much of kind of how the world operates and how the world has been designed, whether it's economic power or power around lines of gender or race or power of economic class, is a major obstacle to us actually transforming the way that the world works towards being more equitable, and really looking at very interesting solutions. And you and I both work in the social sector. It's probably the most fragmented in terms of power, right? Compared to governments, compared to business. And so really about creating, and this is how the principles reinforce each other, the connection, building of collectives, promoting platforms that people can operate on, is ultimately the things that will help to reconfigure how power works. And so while this sounds, quite conceptual still, this was really born from the work of these organizations that in many ways seemed quite micro in, so how do we really support, let's say, a teacher to have and a family to determine what curriculum should be, actually has led to, organizations like Fundación La Escuela Nueva, which started with that principle being, something that has influenced policy in more than 20 countries. So really demonstrating that over time, these kind of deep grassroots agency building approaches are actually necessary for some of these larger scale changes.
Very interesting. And while we were talking, it makes me wonder, what do we need to change, in our manner of thinking to really, put this in practice? And also, I wonder, you are in a very important position, in the Schwab Foundation, the World Economic Forum. How has the World Economic Forum, for example, approached this topic and worked on this duty of bringing this concept to the field?
Oh, it's a important question. I think we sit now at this nexus. The foundation is this really interesting place. We're a community of leading social change makers around the world that is at the nexus of the networks of business and government that is curated by the World Economic Forum and bringing them together. The forum, I think, has had this really important philosophy around multi-stakeholderism, right? And I think that was primarily built on the idea that business is responsible to its stakeholders. What's shifting with time, and it's really interesting to hear Professor Schwab talk about this, is not only that business sees itself and its stakeholders as critical to its own survival and long-term sustainability, but actually business is no longer at the center, right? That business itself is a stakeholder in our collective future. So thinking as multi-stakeholderism, not as a business concept, but actually as a global concept for us all, right? We're all now dependent on what the future of the Earth looks like. And so that, I think, has started to become part of the philosophy of the World Economic Forum as this international organization for public-private cooperation. And the Schwab Foundation, kind of how we have brought that, has really come from our constituents, from people like you, Rodrigo, and many others that in our community that have really challenged, the foundation and the forum to say, a different kind of perspective is emerging, a different voice is needed when we're having global discussions. And so it's about bringing that voice to the table around the perspectives that are heard from the constituents that many social innovators work with around the world. And so I think, we're at this really interesting nexus point where we need to give not only voice, but the opportunity for different kinds of actors to play a really important role in shaping the future. And my one big concern, and I'll raise it here, is that we will go through systems change, right? We are busy going through it. We will develop a green economy. We will develop new digital economies. But in the process of that, if the ownership of who benefits from those economies doesn't change, we will only have a certain kind of systems change, but not really an equitable one. And I think that's what many of us are working to try and see. We have an opportunity, but we need the mechanisms for the participation, both kind of in the process, but also in the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And along the book, you have like 8 study cases of organizations from different parts of the world.
Yeah.
First, I would love to hear like 1 or 2 examples for this, so our audience also can like get to know better like this kind of examples you bring in the book. And also one question, like despite the difference between those organizations, what do you see that unites them? Like what points you have in common in these organizations that you can bring to us?
Well, I'll give you 2 examples, and then which are very different, but then I'll try to connect them. But the first thing to say is that while we looked at these organizations, what we did recognize both in writing the book, but also in the feedback we heard afterwards, is that we were giving visibility and a voice and language and some frameworks to work that actually many organizations do, but is quite hidden under the surface. One of the alternative titles for the book was Deep, or deeper work. So this work that was going on that organizations don't necessarily talk about because it's highly relational. It's about organizing, it's about people, it's about relationships, it's about, changing power dynamics. And I think that while there were very technical and practical ways to do that, it wasn't something they necessarily spoke openly about with donors or had a language for or had management, a strategy around, but it was work that often frontline workers were doing. So I think I wanted to say that. So while there are some great case studies, this work is happening, I think, more than we recognize.
Mm-hmm.
The first I want to bring up is Nidan in Bihar, which it's a bit of a chameleon. In many ways, it looks like a trade union for informal workers who are street vendors in India. So 90% of India's workforce, that makes up 50% of its GDP, is in the informal economy. And there is no laws protecting the rights of these workers. And Nidan focused on street vendors, those that make street foods, markets, stalls, etc., which often were considered by government as unhygienic or unsightly, and in the municipalities trying to clean up their cities were trying to get rid of these, and in the process there was also a lot of abuse and exploitation, and there was no laws to protect them. And so Nidan ended up setting up a national network for street vendors. So in some ways it looked like a labor union, in other ways it was really helping to build capacity, and actually spun off more than 30 organizations developing cooperatives, so better market buying power, improving the hygienic conditions of the markets, so better marketing for their customers, setting up festivals, but also doing things like childcare and education for children of the families that were dependent on these vendors, and ultimately built this national movement that helped to bring in the first law actually in the country, and I think in any country in the world, to protect the rights of street vendors. It's an informality act that is really about creating policy level change around the role of street vendors and informal workers in India. At the same time, they recognized policy change was not enough. The other systemic changes they needed to change was the mindset of the people that worked with them, and really spoke to the exciting cultural component of what street food offers a country like India, and that actually everyone was going to get street food on their lunch break, and so created these festivals celebrating street food, and at the same time improving the hygiene. So they worked partly as a social enterprise, partly as an NGO, partly as a labor union, partly actually as a policy think tank to help develop these strategies, and then are now working with municipalities around the implementation and the accountability for this. And so looking at all the strategies they use in terms of how they organized, the most important thing they did with all of these street vendors and their families, with all of these organizations they spun off, was they focused their work, Nidan, on building the capacity of these people to govern these organizations themselves, make decisions about what should happen, rather than giving them the answer or trying to build the companies for them. It was entirely run by the street vendors and their families themselves. So that's one really interesting and powerful example of something that was very local, very micro, that ended up, with massive country level change. The other organization is called Buurtzorg, which is actually started in the Netherlands. It means neighborhood care. And this is a for-profit social enterprise that was really about building community-based care for elderly that could be cared for at home. So really a service to them and families, but was entirely decentralized and worked in neighborhoods where the operational unit was in a specific neighborhood. So for many years, this organization didn't have an HR officer or a chief marketing officer. All the decisions were actually made locally in the operating unit, depending on what the needs in that neighborhood were, so that the nurses could actually then determine what are the needs of this family, what are the needs of this neighborhood, decide whether to build more capacity, get more stock, how to structure. And what was really interesting during the course of the pandemic, obviously these people at home were more protected than those in the elderly working homes. But Buurtzorg now is a model that has been replicated around the world, but it offers a very different model, a decentralized model of doing business and giving decision making, again, to the greatest point of complexity. The nurse working in the home with the family, understanding what the needs are there, and not necessarily, I guess, I've come from a healthcare world where you have a medical insurance company or some protocol that tells you this is the only way that you're allowed to do it within this budget.
We know very, very well this in Brazil too.
So to connect those two very different stories, that was really about building platforms for decision making, for agency, for distributing power, for distributing resources, and about really understanding the context to then adapt and design what needed to be done. But then that was able to be brought back. And so Buurtzorg has these amazing kind of systems to collect data and track what is happening and how the healthcare of their clients was improving over time. And so being able to then use data to be able to make maybe more macro level decisions.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. And it's very interesting how can we see in these examples that you gave exactly the context that you brought, about the principles of system change, and particularly talk about one that is power, that is also very present in these examples. I also run an organization here in Brazil that it's completely focused on this kind of issue too. How can we empower better the organizations and understand that we also have a lot to learn from them instead of just saying what they need to do. And when you talk about this need of give more voice and more autonomy to the people that we benefit, how does it change the way organizations work? How do you see that organizations need to think differently, and how make the collaboration sound different when we need to shift this vision about power?
It's obviously a challenge, and I don't think it's something necessarily one can tell an organization to do. Most of the organizations we've worked with have had long histories of working with communities and understanding their role, right? And I think that's if historically an organization has been in very much a service mindset, I think it's quite different to change to an agency mindset. But I think that these discussions are coming with donors. I think donors are prepared to start changing also and look at their role. And you've been part of these discussions. There is a narrative recognizing the role of power in philanthropy. And I think what's interesting now is there is scope for understanding that needs to change, and now there is opportunities and examples of how to do that, right? Because I think it does challenge, right? It challenges all of us. It's about control. It's about knowing, well, am I going to achieve the outcomes that we said we would achieve this year if we just give it over to the community to decide what to do, and we give the resources over to the community to decide what to do? So I think it does challenge a lot of what we've built in the social sector as important pillars, which is around accountability, it's around developing and more performance orientation and developing outcomes and measuring those outcomes. And in a way, this sometimes is a bit of a challenge to what we've built over the last couple of decades, is what we think are good things, which is about transparency, accountability, performance. But at the same time, we've perhaps crowded out then the ability for local actors to really have a say and a lot more ownership of the initiatives. And so I think, it's finding that right balance, but also going beyond, participatory processes that are merely consultative, right? And I think what we've seen and what we've learned, and with technology, there's, many of these examples really leverage technology in interesting ways. I think that is becoming, a lot easier to do, and perhaps hopefully less of a challenge to the way traditionally civil society works. So I think there's an evolution happening anyway, but I think there's an ability to mobilize people, to hear voice in ways that we've not had before.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And so I would like to, you said about philanthropy, and I'd like to put this subject in our conversation here.
Yes.
And it's a very direct question. How do you think philanthropy connects with everything we're talking here?
Well, it plays a critical role, and I mean, both in terms of potentially holding things back, but also really being a catalyst, right? Mm-hmm. So I think philanthropy has always played a very important role in supporting, civil society sector, particularly in supporting organizations that can both, work on issues of immediate need and urgency and humanitarian need, through to longer term needs around holding governments to account and doing advocacy, etc., and that whole spectrum. I think, as I mentioned, philanthropy, the discussions within philanthropy are very interesting and very important, right? In terms of the power they hold, the processes they run, the kinds of relationships they have. And I think those are all very healthy, because they've opened up space for much more of this kind of systemic work. So thinking about, some of these trends like trust-based philanthropy, right? Participatory grant making, where some of the grantees in the sector are actually part of how they make decisions, opening up transparency. So I think those all will support these more systemic efforts. But it does sometimes, and I've worked with several funders around how, with a real intentionality to say, how do we fund more systemic change? How do we do that? Recognizing there's some real constraints in how certain foundations have been built, right? They have certain statutes, some certain limitations. And so it's not necessarily always easy to change overnight the way that funding happens. Some foundations have more opportunity and scope to do that. Some new collaborative funds have developed around systemic change, which is starting to play an important role, because it's starting to test and give a visibility to how funders can be more systemic. From examples like Co-Impact, these large funds around being explicit around systemic change, to smaller community-owned funds. And so we looked at also an example of the Red Umbrella Fund, which was actually run by sex workers around improving the lives of sex workers around the world, but it was wholly owned, and the decisions around how the grants were actually allocated were by the kinds of people that were intended to be supported. So I think philanthropy has a huge role to play. I don't think we're going to necessarily get this kind of funding, which supports often quite intangible work that is long-term, talking about changes that are happening over a 5 to 10 to even longer year period. We're not going to get that necessarily from corporate philanthropy. We're not going to get that from government contracts, right? So I think the role of individual, family, foundation philanthropy is critical in this phase. And I think there's a recognition now that there's really a catalytic role to play.
And François, how do you think we can address the challenge of maintaining the high level of philanthropy? For example, as in other parts of the world, during the pandemic, we saw huge booms of donations all over the world. Brazil, for example, if we compare this year with 2020, in 2020 we had almost 6 times like the volume of donations that we are having this year. And of course, this happens because of the critical moment, because of the urgency. But what do you think, how do you think we could address this challenge of maintaining this high level, not only in the urgency, but as like a behavior for the society?
It's obviously a difficult question, and I think something the pandemic beyond the crisis. I think the pandemic was interesting because it affected every single person, and so every single person had some personal connection to that crisis, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously that's not necessarily the case with everything else, and so that's why storytelling remains an important initiative, because it tries to connect with the individuals. But I think it's also opening up the space for the discussions around, what our future holds. And it's clear now that climate will affect everyone. Inequality is starting, we're going to see that affecting everyone in some way or another. So, I think what we've asked for, and I think what we've seen in the book, is that organizations that are able to, and donors that are able to open up honest conversations. And so there was a group by the Langley Chase Trust that built an elephant circle. And the elephant circle was talking about the elephant in the room. It's this English expression about the thing you don't talk about, but it's so big that you can't ignore it, but no one's talking about it. And I think we need to create the spaces for those discussions, because the other parts, tax incentives, all of the other pieces that we could think about that would perhaps incentivize it, will not overcome the fact that kind of the realization that there's a big elephant in the room, is that actually in our very lifetimes, some of these challenges are going to play out on everyone, and we're going to see massive shifts. And so I think it's difficult to obviously maintain that sense of crisis, and I don't know if the crisis argument does always work, because it does maintain fatigue. But I think trying to understand the longer term commitments we need to make, and how some of that needs to be front loaded, right? That we need to build capacity to change those longer term trajectories now. And I mean, we're seeing that in the climate space. I don't know if you've seen, but the percentage of philanthropy towards climate initiatives based on their total portfolios was very, very small until the most recent years. It's slowly growing, but it's still relatively small. So the challenge is, how do we not also get that to take away from some other critical challenges around education, health, economic opportunity, building livelihoods, etc.
Yeah, and that's why, as you said, the narratives and the storytelling are very, very, very important tools for that.
Absolutely.
And also, according to the last World Giving Index, which is like a generous ranking for all over the world, I think they track around 130 countries in the world. It's produced by Charities Aid Foundation. It was interesting, the result, like the developing countries like Indonesia and Kenya are like amongst the most generous countries in the world, when at the same time you have countries such as France and Italy that they're in the bottom of this ranking. What do you think this says about the connection, the association between the culture of giving and economic and social development?
I guess it shows it's not correlated directly to being a wealthy nation, right? And so there's much more around, as you said, around culture, around the sense of unity. And I think religion plays an interesting role, of course, so we can't discount religion playing an important role. We see in the Middle East as well, the role that religion plays in encouraging giving, and I think it's clear that philanthropy is not only about being wealthy, right? The term of the word is what philanthropos, love of your fellow human being, right? And I think it's a sense of recognizing also what in those cultures. I don't have the data in front of me, but what is valued, I think, is an important question as well. And I think religion plays a role in what is valued. What do we value as society? And clearly, the media plays a critical role in what do we value as society. And so, the work you do is so important in this, because it is about re-understanding what we hold and what we place value in.
And also, like, when it's interesting that you said that, because when you see like the concept of the World Giving Index, for example, they track the volunteering work, and also if you have like helped a stranger. So it's not only about money donations, but also about the act of donating, like your time or like your knowledge, your network, or something like this. So interesting. So we're coming to the end, François, and I have one last question for you. Like, it was a very great conversation. I think we got to learn a lot about the concepts of social change. And I just would love you to talk, like, in general, how would you characterize the problems of our current industry of social change? Like, you said a lot about this, and you said a little bit in the introduction. But I would love to hear about you, like, why does it often fail to act on the root of the problems of social inequality and fight against hunger, for example?
I think, that industry, as we called it, of social change has this long route, right? Has this long history. And I think we've, even the social sector as it exists today only exists because of the industrial era. We're almost a byproduct of industrialization, right? That in a way, because these other aspects of society were not being cared for, that even the capital of kind of how we act out these initiatives, these social initiatives, is really a byproduct of capitalism in a way. And so in some way we need to recognize that not only is the work we do part of this complex, right, but also the way we do it. We've all been educated, at least those of us, I guess, over the age of 20 something, in a system that was about creating people that would work in this industrial world, right? And in a way, we've applied that same mindset to how we address social change. So we see problems, we try to fix them, we silo them down, we try to develop very complicated plans around how to address them. And we haven't seen, I've come from the world of medicine, which has done that with the human body, right? Is a good example. We've become amazing super specialists on, the left lobe of the kidney, right? And yet we've forgotten to see the whole human being. And, we've seen this now with mental health emerging, and how what an important role the mind and the body play together. And I think in a way we've done the same with social change. We've become experts in education, in healthcare, in poverty alleviation programs, etc. And somehow we've missed some of the kind of really important holistic aspects around kind of what the sector is here to do and how these things are interrelated and interdependent. And we see this with so many challenges, right, that are interdependent on each other. And yet we haven't worked out essentially how to tackle these things together and how to work as the whole. And it's clear that that is this kind of space that we've now in, and we're asking these questions where we feel, despite doing all of this amazing work in the social sector, despite throwing in billions of dollars of philanthropy, trillions of dollars of aid, that we still find ourselves stuck, right? We still find inequality growing. And so it's time to really ask ourselves different questions. And so, the book in a way is not necessarily an answer, but is a set of questions and a set of provocations and demonstrations of alternatives, right? And I think this is the era where we recognize we need to be working, in all kinds of really important collaborations, right? And we need to start seeing, both our society and the earth as this whole system, and that we're all playing an important part in supporting that system together, which means we need to get away from that linear model of, I have my one organization and this is what I'm going to do by the end of the year, and this is what I'm going to tell my donor. Yes, we need to operate like that to survive, but there needs to be a different level of operating, and that actually organizations need to build the capacity to do this other kind of more systemic work, right? And I think that was one of the calls from the book as well. And what we recognized is that we need to give that a name, give that capacity, give that investment, give that support, and that all organizations who work in the sector need to develop that muscle, need to develop talent in those spaces, even if it's not going to necessarily have a very clear outcome at the end of this year.
François, thank you so much. It was very, very inspiring. I think like we all that are hearing like your words, we are like very thinking a lot about the way we work, the way we think about this social work. And for sure, I'm sure like lots of people will be very inspired and will like maybe change the way they think about this issue. So thank you so much for your collaboration here, for your participation in our talk.
Thanks so much, Rodrigo. And I mean, this has only been an inspiration because I've failed and learned myself, and because I've had the privilege really of working with organizations like yours and many of those through the Schwab Foundation network that do this incredible work. And I have the privilege of being able to shine a light on that and bring attention to how we all do things differently.
Thank you. Let's keep working together. Obrigado.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye. E aí, pessoal, gostaram da conversa? Bom, eu adorei. O François é uma das pessoas mais, além de ser uma pessoa muito inspiradora, é uma pessoa que tem um profundo conhecimento desse campo. É uma pessoa que vive intensamente a prática desse campo. Vocês veem nos exemplos, quem teve a oportunidade de ler o livro sabe a riqueza que essas histórias, essas 8 histórias que ele traz no livro, trazem, né, sobre todo esse conceito que ele trouxe para a gente na conversa. Para mim chama muita atenção, né, a maneira como ele encara isso de uma forma otimista, né, como ele entende que realmente não adianta a gente olhar só os pedaços do problema, quando na verdade a gente tem que olhar a essência do que a gente vive hoje, né? Ele deu muitos exemplos dentro da conversa. Então, enfim, espero que vocês tenham gostado. Eu aprendi demais também. E, bom, que venham novas conversas como essas. Espero que vocês fiquem ligados aí nas próximas conversas do Encontros Doar. E muito obrigado pela audiência.
Muito bom. Que bela conversa, Rô. Eu acho que a coisa que mais me chama atenção na fala dele é que você, no fim, tem que pensar no que não dá para a gente mudar as coisas que foram construídas dessa maneira, né? Enfim, com esse tipo de mentalidade, com esse tipo de trabalho, fazendo do mesmo jeito, né? Eu gosto muito quando ele fala da gente ter que mudar a maneira como a gente trabalha para poder mudar as estruturas de poder, para daí conseguir mudar, né, os problemas complexos que a gente tem pela frente. E isso tem muito a ver com o tema não só com a discussão que a gente sempre tem, né, nos nossos produtos, canais e tal, de confiança nas organizações e da doação como um gesto de confiança. Então, né, essa crítica que a gente faz sempre ao doador que doa querendo uma métrica que é a mesma que ele espera do investimento financeiro dele, é a mesma que ele espera de uma empresa querer isso, né, de uma doação que ele faz para uma organização, ou querer, né, esse discurso de que o que falta às organizações são profissionais, ignorando o conhecimento de quem está mesmo dentro do contexto, de quem vive a causa e que tem conhecimentos empíricos, talvez se não tem um diploma de MBA, mas tem conhecimentos empíricos importantíssimos para achar soluções. Então, essa visão de confiar, né, em quem está na ponta é muito importante para a gente realmente conseguir valorizar outras maneiras de trabalhar, outras formas de encontrar solução. E a questão, né, da distribuição, né, da mudança de poder envolve muito o acesso a recursos, né? Isso é uma coisa que, embora a gente sempre fale aqui que doar deveria ser como votar, porque é um ato cívico, tem uma diferença muito grande entre a doação e o voto, né, que é a democracia, né? O voto da pessoa mais rica tem o mesmo peso da pessoa mais pobre, enquanto a doação não, né? Enfim, quem pode doar mais pode influenciar mais o processo, né? Tanto pode influenciar o caminho que as causas vão tomar, pode fazer com que algumas causas sejam menos priorizadas do que outras por razões, porque sejam causas mais bonitas de colocar no site, no currículo, sejam porque é um interesse pessoal e outras causas importantes ficam para trás nisso. A mesma coisa vale para organizações grandes recebendo mais recursos, cada vez mais, conforme mais elas aparecem na mídia, enquanto organizações pequenas que também fazem trabalho importantíssimo, recebendo menos. Então, alterar essa forma de poder também no acesso aos recursos é algo vital e que depende muito da gente conseguir construir uma cultura de doação forte, baseada na sociedade civil e não só nas grandes doações de grandes filantropos e nos contratos governamentais, como ele falou. E para você, qual foi a grande moral da história?
Nossa, não, acho que é bem por aí, Rô. Assim, bom, primeiro que ele é um super especialista, né? Eu acho que o fato dele estar falando com o chapéu de quem está ali dentro do Fórum Econômico Mundial, dentro de quem está né? Acho que o chapéu de quem está tão envolvido, né, nesse contexto de tanto poder, de tanta capacidade de transformação, mesmo que ao mesmo tempo seja um contexto de muita confusão também, como a gente sabe. Eu acho que isso, né, já dá uma visão diferente, né, do tema. A gente está falando de um cara que convive com iniciativas, né, de empreendedores sociais que tem altíssima escala, né, assim, os exemplos que ele trouxe, né, na Índia, na Holanda, são exemplos, assim, claro, muito bem sucedidos, mas que mostram, né, o tamanho da escala que se ganha quando você entende o que ele está falando, né. Para mim, me chamou muito a atenção na conversa quando ele fala da questão da propriedade, né. Não adianta a gente ter grandes soluções se a propriedade continuar na mão de alguns poucos, porque isso vai continuar alimentando a desigualdade, vai continuar alimentando um sistema em que o benefício da iniciativa, da solução que pode resolver determinado problema, continue na mão de poucos e não chegue onde tem que chegar. São justamente as pessoas que sofrem com aquele problema. Então, às vezes, né, quando você pega um livro como o dele, ou quando você tem uma conversa mais profunda, você tem sempre um cuidado de falar, putz, é muita teoria, mas eu acho que o François ele consegue pousar isso na prática, né? Acho que você sai, quem é empreendedor social, quem tem interesse pela filantropia, quem é doador, seja o grande doador, o pequeno doador, o empreendedor que já está estabelecido, o empreendedor que está começando. Eu acho que quem escuta o François falando, quem entende um pouco do que ele traz, de alguma forma consegue olhar um pouco do caminho que a gente tem que construir, né? Em tempos de COP27, para falar do clima, em tempos de tantos encontros, tantos desafios no planeta, eu acho que se a gente conseguisse botar para dentro um pouco disso que o François traz, né, dessa visão mais prática e desse otimismo, eu acho que está aí um caminho para uma solução mais sistêmica mesmo, da gente conseguir conectar as nossas iniciativas de forma que elas realmente gerem a tal colaboração, o tal equilíbrio do poder, né, o tal benefício que a gente tanto vislumbra. Então, eu acho que foi muito interessante poder receber toda essa teoria, mas ao mesmo tempo pousá-la na prática com o François, e acho que a gente tem o privilégio, né, de poder conviver dentro desse ecossistema da Schwab para poder cada vez mais entender mesmo como é que o nosso impacto como empreendedor social pode ser escalado e como que a gente também pode apoiar outros empreendedores, né, trabalhar em rede com outros empreendedores sociais para que essa escala de fato aconteça. Então, foi uma conversa, assim, muito, muito inspiradora para mim.
Trabalhar em rede, a gente sabe que nunca é fácil, a gente aprende isso na escola já, quando tem que fazer trabalho em equipe e em quebra-paus toda a vida. Trabalhar em rede é dificílimo, né? E a gente ainda tem que descobrir a melhor forma de fazer isso. Tem muita gente estudando, tentando, mas, de fato, essa ideia da propriedade, né, como é uma ideia industrial, capitalista, assim, né? A gente tem que olhar para soluções sociais como tecnologias compartilháveis, né? Esse é a mudança mesmo de mentalidade. Então, trabalhar em rede talvez não necessariamente signifique fazer juntos, mas compartilhar informações para que cada um possa fazer e realizar no seu contexto, né, aquela prática, aquela mudança, aquele tipo de projeto, para a gente avançar, né, em todo lugar, não ficar tudo na mão, né? Essa ideia das super ONGs, das super organizações que concentram a renda, concentram o poder, acaba repetindo o mesmo modelo que a gente tem no capitalismo, né? Então, não de fazer essa divisão para que possa fazer impacto local com organizações locais, com pessoas que conhecem a realidade naquele local e que podem se adaptar ao que está acontecendo ali. Essa é uma conversa que tem muito a ver com outro tema da doação, que é a da confiança e a da generosidade, a gente ser capaz de mudar essa maneira de pensar do é meu para o é nosso, tanto quando a gente olha para os problemas quanto a gente olha para as soluções. E a gente vai falar um pouco mais disso amanhã na nossa próxima mesa. Por hoje é isso, pessoal. A gente agradece a participação de todo mundo que ficou aí ouvindo esse primeiro dia do Encontros Doar. A live fica gravada aqui para quem quiser assistir depois, compartilhar, passar adiante. E amanhã, no mesmo horário, no mesmo canal, a gente te espera com um papo inspirador com a Edinalva Moura, do Pacto para a Promoção da Equidade Racial, com o escritor Fábio De Boni e com a Letícia Vieira, do Fundo Frida, em que a gente vai ter uma conversa sobre como a nossa atuação cidadã tem potencial de mudar o mundo, com a mesa que dá o título a esse evento. Doar é um ato político, como o apoio às causas pode transformar, será a realidade tanto quanto o voto? Amanhã a gente fala mais disso. Obrigada, Rô, pela sua companhia. Obrigada ao François por toda essa conversa e ao time do Instituto MOL, que está aqui nos bastidores colocando tudo isso no ar. E obrigada a você que assistiu. Amanhã tem mais. Abraço, até mais.
Valeu, beijo, pessoal. Obrigado.